an author. I'm also joined by James Peterson, the Director of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of English at Lehigh University. Gentlemen, to both of you, welcome. James, let me ask you something. Listening to Samantha Power doesn't sound like somebody who's speaking on behalf of a country that abstained from the vote. She sounds very much like she wishes she was able to vote against that resolution.
Well, I think the abstinence here is certainly a powerful departure from where the U.S. has been on this. I think UN Resolution 2324 is going to go down as a kind of historic diplomatic moment. It's, as you know, Ali, this is a very complicated issue. And I think that whole phrase that Ambassador Powers is using, no legal validity to those settlements, is where the Obama administration is sort of trying to draw a line here. So the abstinence here is, remember, the abstinence means that the U.S. could have intervened and essentially vetoed this entire piece of resolution, but it decided not to do that, and in so doing did condemn the sort of sprawling settlements that we see over there in Israel. But it's a very complicated piece. I don't know if we can get into the weeds here. I'm going to defer here to Jonathan Alter, who will probably give us some insight on where we go from here. But this is certainly a departure from where the U.S. has been.
That's an easy job to do. Ask Jonathan Alter where we're supposed to go from here. Jonathan, that was remarkably interesting. She argued the case that the Israelis always argue with the United States, that the whole operation is prejudiced against them. She argued the case that these people cannot get it together once to condemn Syria and Bashar al-Assad and a lot of other important things that are going on in the world. And yet she could not, or was not allowed to, we're not sure how this all happened, not allowed to veto this thing. What is that message? That's a very strange message.
Well, she is laying down a very tough message to cover a retreat, essentially a retreat from what had been, for many years, U.S. policy, which was to veto these kinds of resolutions. So Barack Obama is leaving office, laying down a marker. He didn't go as far as Jimmy Carter wanted him to go and actually recognize a Palestinian state, even though the issues haven't been resolved. But he's laying down a marker that his administration wants to be on record as having essentially reinforced
What's the importance of the marker? Because the Israelis think that the United Nations is unfriendly ground, yet they are there and they continue to participate.
Well, I think it reflects, the fact that the United States has been very upset by these settlements over the years, and Obama is now freed from any elective pressure.
Let's listen a little more, and then we'll get you some more comments. More on Samantha Power at the United Nations.
This resolution reflects trends that will permanently destroy the hope of a two-state solution if they continue on their current course. The United States has not taken the step of voting in support of this resolution because the resolution is too narrowly focused on settlements, when we all know, or we all should know, that many other factors contribute significantly to the tensions that perpetuate this conflict. Let us be clear, even if every single settlement were to be dismantled tomorrow, peace still would not be attainable without both sides acknowledging uncomfortable truths and making difficult choices. That is an indisputable fact. Yet it is one that is too often overlooked by members of the United Nations and by members of this council. For Palestinian leaders, that means recognizing the obvious, that in addition to taking innocent lives, the incitement to violence, the glorification of terrorists, and the growth of violent extremism erodes prospects for peace, as this resolution makes crystal clear. The most recent wave of Palestinian violence has seen terrorists commit hundreds of attacks, including driving cars into crowds of innocent civilians and stabbing mothers in front of their children. Yet rather than condemn these attacks, Hamas, other radical factions, and even certain members of Fatah have held up the terrorists as heroes and used social media to incite others to follow in their murderous footsteps. And while President Abbas and his party's leaders have made clear their opposition to violence, terrorism, and extremism, they have too often failed to condemn specific attacks or condemn the praise heaped upon the perpetrators. Our vote today does not in any way diminish the United States' steadfast and unparalleled commitment to the security of Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East. We would not have let this resolution pass had it not also addressed counterproductive actions by the Palestinians. We have to recognize that Israel faces very serious threats in a very tough neighborhood. Israelis are rightfully concerned about making sure There is not a new terrorist haven next door. President Obama and this administration have shown an unprecedented commitment to Israel's security because that is what we believe in. Our commitment to that security has never wavered, and it never will. Even with a financial crisis and budget deficits, we repeatedly increase funding to support Israel's military. And in September, the Obama administration signed a memorandum of understanding to provide $38 billion in security assistance to Israel over the next 10 years, the largest single pledge of military assistance in U.S. history to any country. And as the Israeli Prime Minister himself has noted, our military and intelligence cooperation is unprecedented. We believe...
Samantha Power at the United Nations discussing why the United States abstained from a vote condemning Israel for its settlements in the West Bank and calling for their dismantlement, but at the same time did not veto the proposal, which the U.S. would have been typically expected to do and was expected to do. I want to go back to James Peterson for a second at Lehigh University. James, you put the question forward, where does the U.S. go from here? This is interesting. As Jonathan Alter said, they're laying down a marker, and yet this continues. This speech by Samantha Power continues to sound like a defense of Israel.
Well, because politically, I think that's where they have to be, right? Or at least that's where the U.S. has been since the founding of Israel. This is really complicated, Alan, in a couple ways. One, Samantha Powers just mentioned that $38 billion, right? And that's a very important piece of what they want to underscore here as they're departing from past policy in terms of vetoing these resolutions. You can hear in her conversation, she even made the mistake of referring to it as a vote. This is not a vote. This is abstinence here. This is the United States abstaining from the voting process, a process they could have vetoed, which would have been sort of business as usual. But I think there's some really complicated things emerging from this. This is looking at Zionism in the contemporary moment in a way that has certain kinds of racial implications. It's also trying to balance out the sort of pro-Israel stance that the United States has been in for a long time with starting to think about some of the human rights issues that are existing there that are being perpetrated by the Israeli government. And so, again, very, very complicated terrain that Samantha Powers is trying to navigate here, and a very nuanced position for the United States to take by making the by abstaining from a vote
and then saying all the things that she's saying. Jonathan Alter, we're getting reaction now very quickly from senior U.S. elected officials. Senator Tom Cotton has come in with this comment from Arkansas. He said, President Obama is personally responsible for this anti-Israel resolution. His diplomats secretly coordinated the vote, yet he doesn't even have the courage of his own convictions to vote for it. This cowardly, disgraceful action cements President Obama's richly deserved legacy as the most anti-Israel president in American history. Samantha Power was very clearly outlining the reasons in which that it is something that some Republicans have wanted to label President Obama with. It's just empirically not true.
Yeah, it's not true because there's been more aid under President Obama than any other president. He has stood up for Israel repeatedly when it's been attacked. So that's just political rhetoric. On top of that, you have the nuclear deal with Iran, which, according to Israeli intelligence senior officers, former head of Mossad and Shin Bet, is in the national security interest of Israel because it helps protect Israel, which would likely have been the first target of an Iranian nuclear attack, and they now can't do anything for at least 10 years. So what Senator Cotton said is not accurate, but it is fair to say that this is a change in administration policy at the 11th hour. And it's interesting that it was an abstention, because if you go back to when Barack Obama was in the Illinois state legislature, he was criticized in the state Senate for abstaining on many bills.
Right.
And it became an issue in the presidential campaign in 2008. It is a little bit of a form of ducking, you know, not really taking responsibility for coming out on one side, or the other. And in that sense, it's symbolic of this president's retreat from the region.
Right.
He wants to pivot to Asia and not have the United States get bogged down in these endless disputes in the Middle East.
Good luck with that, though. This
is reflective.
Not much likely.
Of course, it all changed when Trump comes in, because he's going to have a very hardline pro.
Let's go to Hugh. Hugh Hewitt's joining us. Hugh Hewitt of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Hugh, first of all, as you know, Jonathan points out that it's in keeping with some things to abstain, but it is definitely not in keeping with U.S. policy at the United Nations to not veto something like this. Senator Tom Cotton's comment here is a very popular Republican line that is, again, empirically not true. Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu don't like each other, but the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is not weakened.
I have to disagree with you, Ali, and with my friend Jonathan. I do believe he is the most anti-Israel president we've had in modern times.
By what measure?
I believe that this is a...
By what measure?
By not vetoing this, which would have been vetoed by any previous modern president.
This makes him the most anti-Israel president in years?
And if I can finish, the key
you said
here
he has
is what
been
Senator
until
Cotton
this
said
moment,
and what Senator Schumer has said.
Until today, what made him the most anti-Israel president?
His refusal to listen to Netanyahu and the Israeli government when the Iran deal was signed. It's not the amount of aid that we send. Congress is responsible for that. But I agree with Senator Schumer. This ought to have been vetoed. I agree with Lindsey Graham. The UN ought to have its appropriations cut. It's not just Tom Cotton. Chuck Schumer is the Democratic minority leader, and they're going to stay in the minority for a long time, and I would like those 25 Senate Democrats on the ballot in 2018 to come up and defend what is an atrocious betrayal of our ally today at the United Nations. It's really an outrageous day for American-Israeli relations.
All right, so Senator, let me just ask you this. Samantha Power, the UN ambassador, really outlined the degree to which the United States supports Israel and the degree to which the Security Council doesn't tend to be fair toward Israel. I think she outlined that. I don't know how much of it you got to hear, but it was really, really clear. She said it. She said the UN Security Council won't criticize Syria. It won't do all sorts of things that normal people would do, but it gets on Israel no matter what happened. That seemed like a fairly balanced explanation about what's going on.
Ali, for this administration, it's always important not to listen to what they say, but to see what they do. President Obama declared a red line in Syria, but he did nothing when Bashar Assad used chemical weapons. He declared he would lead from behind, but in fact, he didn't do any leading at all. He called ISIS the JVs, and he acted not to stop them until they had rampaged across
but Hugh,
Iraq and Syria.
this isn't an all-out indictment. We're talking about Israel. The weapon sales to Israel that are funded by and provided by the United States don't happen without the president's approval in this country.
He lacked the willingness to veto appropriations, which includes that. But objectively, just objectively, Ali, no one has ever vetoed or abstained on a situation like this. And I would ask Jonathan or you to come up with a situation where an anti-Israel UN Security Council resolution has not been vetoed. When has that ever not happened before? It just hasn't, and that's because this president and Samantha Power, who stood by while Aleppo burned, are now standing by when the UN gangs up on Israel. It's outrageous.
So you're right, Hugh, that this kind of resolution has not been approved or abstained from, thereby approved in the past. They've vetoed all these resolutions in the past. But this particular resolution is consistent with what has been U.S. policy all along. So to define it as an anti-Israel resolution when it's consistent with what Israel agreed to after the 1967 war, what Israel has agreed to pretty consistently, that there be movement toward a two-state solution, and that movement can't come without some resolution of the settlements issue. But where I think you're onto something very important, Hugh, is just looking ahead. When you talked about the United States cutting off, or at least threatening to cut off, aid to the United Nations, we have a coming confrontation between the United States and the United Nations when Donald Trump becomes president. That is clear. We are going to be talking about a struggle between the United Nations and the United States for the next 4 years, and it's going to get very ugly.
Guys, thank you very much for your analysis. Hugh, always good to see you. James Peterson from Lehigh University and Jonathan Alter, I appreciate your analysis here. The problems don't end. We're talking next about our complicated relationship with Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin